Imagine you're just a 12-year-old boy living in a quiet Bulgarian village in the year 1550. The early morning fog wraps around the valley like a blanket while you walk beside your father, helping him guide the sheep across the field. The soft clinking of the bells tied around their necks is the only music you've ever really known. Inside your small home, your mother is busy preparing breakfast: warm bread, fresh from the fire, and a cup of goat's milk that tastes of comfort and safety. The kind of meal that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever touch your world. But then it happens. The sound of horses, fast and heavy, striking the stone road. Your father's face drains of color, and your mother's hands tremble so badly that the clay jug she was holding slips and shatters across the floor. In that single moment, the peace you've always known feels like it's about to be ripped away. Because everyone in the village knows what those hoofbeats mean. The Sultan's men have arrived. You crouch behind a wooden cart, peeking out as the Ottoman riders climb down from their tall horses. Their robes shine like silk, untouched by dust despite their long journey, and in their hands they carry scrolls, lists, and the kind of authority that leaves no room for mercy. Their sharp eyes sweep over the villagers one by one, cold and distant, as if choosing cattle at a market. Then one of them points straight at you. Your mother collapses, begging through her tears, her words pouring out in a language the officials don't even care to understand. Your father doesn't move, doesn't speak, because he knows the truth. To resist would mean death, not just for him but for all of you. Rough hands drag you forward, and the men tell your parents it is an honor, that you are being chosen to serve the Sultan and maybe even rise to greatness. But as the wagon pulls away, all you can really hear are your mother's sobs echoing behind you, fading further and further away. You will never see her again. That was the moment your old life ended and your new life as one of the Sultan's palace boys began. Inside those walls, horrors were waiting for you that would make you wish for nothing more than the simple days of walking in the mist with your sheep. Before we dive deeper into this hidden history of pain and survival, if you enjoy uncovering the dark truths of the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. And I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from? I think it's amazing that we can explore these forgotten stories together, no matter how far apart we are. The long march to Istanbul was your first bitter taste of what lay ahead. Dozens of boys were herded together, forced to walk for weeks across rocky ground with almost nothing to eat. At night you slept in the open or under flimsy shelters that did little against the wind and rain. The weak, those who got sick, who stumbled too many times, or who simply gave up hope, were left lying in the dirt to die. It was your first lesson in Ottoman rule. Weakness had no place. Only the strongest, smartest, and most silent could survive. A boy about 2 years older than you walked at your side. His name was Nikos, taken from a fishing village in Greece. On the third night, he tried to run. He didn't even make it a mile before the guards dragged him back and beat him in front of everyone. His screams carried across the dark fields, and no matter how tightly you closed your eyes, you couldn't block out the sound. That night taught you something: permanent escape was hopeless, and resistance only brought more pain. By the time you reached the edge of Istanbul, you had already learned how to survive by being invisible. You kept your mouth shut unless spoken to, moved quietly, and avoided the guards' eyes whenever they started looking too long. You noticed the empty spaces in your line of boys, the ones who had vanished in the night. Some had tried to run, others just couldn't face another sunrise. Each absence was a reminder that it could just as easily be you. When the city finally appeared, it should have been breathtaking. The tall minarets speared the sky, the dome of Hagia Sophia towered above everything, and the palace stretched out like an endless maze of marble and gold. But instead of awe, a cold dread weighed inside you. Because this glittering city wasn't a promise of greatness, it was a cage. And inside it, you feared you would lose not just your freedom, but the last pieces of who you were. When you finally reached Istanbul, The ordeal wasn't over, it was only beginning. The first thing you faced was the selection. Ottoman officials lined the surviving boys up like animals at a market. They checked your teeth as if you were a horse, pulled at your arms and legs, made you jump to test your reflexes, and asked you to repeat whatever scraps of reading or counting you knew. They studied your face the way an artist examines a painting, judging your looks, your skin, your build, as though you were nothing more than an object to be sorted. The strongest were pushed toward the Janissary corps, trained as soldiers. The brightest and most handsome were marked for the palace school, a place they called the Enderun. To the world, it was described as a school for the gifted. But to boys like you, torn from your homes, it was more like a gilded prison that tested not just your body, but your spirit. You were one of the ones chosen for the Enderun inside the mighty Topkapi Palace. The officials who made the choice looked at your clear eyes, smooth skin, and quick answers, and they smiled. But those smiles were not kind. They were the satisfied grins of men who believed they had found something useful, a piece of clay they could shape however they pleased. They promised learning and greatness, and in a way, it was true. You would study languages, Arabic, Persian, Turkish. You would practice mathematics, astronomy, literature, and law. They even taught music, calligraphy, and crafts. On the surface, it sounded like the chance of a lifetime. But hidden beneath the lessons was the real price: your freedom, your family, your very self. The palace itself was a beautiful trap. Endless marble corridors, chambers glittering with gold, and narrow hidden passages that whispered of secrets. You were taken to a dormitory filled with rows of small beds draped in silk sheets that felt less like comfort and more like chains. That first night you lay awake, staring into the darkness, your ears full of sounds that would haunt you for years. Boys crying softly into their pillows, trying not to be heard. Whispers in strange languages you couldn't understand. Heavy footsteps of older boys and guards moving down the hall, their presence sharp and threatening. In your hand, you clutched the little wooden cross your mother had pressed into your palm on the day you were taken. It was the only piece of home you had left. But when morning came, it was gone, confiscated as if to erase the last trace of who you used to be. You were given a new name, Mehmet, and ordered to forget everything about your Christian past. The conversion ceremony was filled with pomp, as if you had willingly chosen their faith. But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't a choice, it was a demand. You repeated the words they forced into your mouth, while inside you clung to the sound of your mother's lullabies and your father's stories. The harshest lesson you learned in the palace wasn't about books or numbers. It was how easily they could strip away your will and rebuild you into something they owned. Advancement wasn't just about good grades or hard work. It depended on obedience, on pleasing the right people, and pleasing could mean things no child should ever be forced to understand. Your first real warning came from a boy named Amit, who had already been in the system 3 years. One night he sat on your bed without asking, his smile thin and unsettling. "You're new," he said, his voice carrying both promise and threat. "You don't know how this place works yet. But I do. Stick with me, and I can protect you. I can make sure the teachers notice you. I can help you rise." And just like that, you began to realize what survival inside these walls would truly cost. He placed his hand on your shoulder, and your whole body stiffened. At 12 years old, you had never been touched like that by someone you didn't know, and the way he leaned close made your skin crawl. His voice dropped to a whisper, smooth but threatening. "You'll need to show me your thanks," he said. "There are ways boys like you can repay older students. Quiet ways just between us." His words filled you with dread. It was the same trap countless boys before you had faced say no, and you risked beatings, being cut off from any help, and losing all chance of moving forward in the palace. Say yes, and you gave away the last fragile piece of your childhood, forced into a world that treated your body as a currency to buy protection. There was no right answer, only the desperate need to survive. The palace ran on an unspoken system of exploitation, one that had existed for generations. Eunuchs, many of them castrated when they were boys themselves, carried deep scars of their own pasts. Instead of shielding newcomers, most used their positions to control and exploit them, enforcing the same cruelty they had once endured. Older students preyed on younger ones too, continuing a cycle of abuse that stretched back so far it seemed normal to everyone inside. What outsiders might call shameful was here woven into the fabric of daily life. The most powerful officials freely claimed the boys they found attractive, knowing full well there was no one to stop them. For those who caught the eye of a patron, life could suddenly change. They might be fed better, dressed in finer clothes, or granted special tutors to advance their studies. But the cost was clear. They had to give up control of their bodies and pretend it was a privilege. Those who refused, who pushed back or angered the wrong man, often ended up beaten, pushed into miserable jobs, or erased from palace records as though they had never existed. The damage this system caused was not just physical but emotional. Cut off from your parents, stripped of your name, and forced into a life where your worth was measured by how useful you were to others, boys developed wounds that never truly healed. Some adapted by becoming calculating and cunning, using their looks and charm to trade for comfort. Others closed off completely, going through each day like shadows, their spirits slowly withering away. You saw both paths unfold before your eyes. Dmitri, a boy taken from a village not far from yours, quickly learned to flirt with older students and teachers. Within months, he had new robes, extra food, and a private tutor for languages. But his laughter was gone. His eyes were hollow, and he no longer spoke of his family or the home he once loved. When younger boys arrived, he studied them the same way officials had once studied him, his gaze sharp and cold. Then there was Stephanos, the son of a Greek fisherman. He resisted every advance, endured whippings and humiliation, and slowly wasted away. He moved like a ghost through the palace, doing what was required but never truly present. One morning his bed was empty, and nobody ever spoke his name again. You tried to walk a line between these two fates, accepting just enough to survive while clinging to some part of yourself that still remembered who you were. But the palace was built to crush that balance. Every day brought a fresh test, another trap, another reminder that compromise could only last so long. The system was designed to break you and reshape you into what it wanted. Even foreign travelers who caught glimpses of life inside the Ottoman court sensed that something dark was happening, though their words could never fully capture the cruel world you were living in. Ambassadors from Europe often wrote down what they saw in the Ottoman palace, and their words paint a disturbing picture. A Venetian envoy in the 1500s mentioned how strangely affectionate the officials were with the young boys serving them. He said it unsettled him to watch children no older than 10 or 11, dressed in shining silks and glittering jewels, behaving with an ease toward grown men that clearly went beyond what a servant should show his master. A French diplomat a century later was even more direct. At a royal reception, he described the young pages gliding through the grand halls like colorful birds trapped in cages, their faces lowered, their bodies decorated for display. What troubled him most was the way certain officials looked at these children, as if they owned them entirely, and the flashes of fear that crossed the boys' eyes whenever their masters drew near. Life inside the palace broke boys down piece by piece. Dormitories were crowded and gave no privacy, every action watched and controlled. You were woken before sunrise to say prayers you had been forced to memorize, and meals were just enough to keep you alive, never generous, and always at set times. The days followed a strict schedule that allowed no time to think, rest, or resist. Punishments were cruel and carefully planned to shame you into obedience. If you dared to speak your old language, keep a tradition, or show any lack of excitement for palace life, you would pay for it. Beatings, public humiliation, or long hours trapped in a tiny, airless chamber were common. You still remember Milo's, a boy caught praying the way his family had taught him. He was stripped naked and left standing in the courtyard the whole day, while the others were told to laugh at him. The message could not have been clearer. Your past was not only forbidden, it was something to feel ashamed of. Even rewards in the palace carried their own poison. Better meals, softer bedding, new clothing, or a chance to touch a book or instrument were all dangled in front of you like bait. These small comforts became treasures in a world where everything was controlled, and they could only be earned by obeying the rules, working hard, or pleasing those in power in ways you wished you didn't understand. This created a tangled web of bargains and loyalties, making true resistance nearly impossible. You grew up too quickly, forced to think like someone far older. You figured out that helping older boys with their lessons might spare you from their cruelty. Excelling in certain studies might win the attention of a teacher who could shield you. Showing cheerful obedience, even when your heart ached, sometimes opened tiny doors of freedom that felt enormous in such a suffocating place. Some boys dreamed of running away, but escape was almost impossible. The palace sat on a peninsula, surrounded by water, guarded on every side. The few who tried often ended in tragedy. You saw this with your own eyes when a boy attempted to swim across the Golden Horn. He was dragged back barely breathing, and then beaten so severely in front of everyone that he was never the same again. His broken body was left as a warning to crush any thought of rebellion in the rest of you. A few boys managed to slip away, but freedom was not the blessing they imagined. After so many years inside, their old selves had been erased. Families no longer recognized them, villages turned them away, and without the palace's strict system, they had no idea how to survive. Many were captured and brought back within days, while others wandered aimlessly, free in name but lost in a world that no longer had a place for them. As you grew older in the palace system, you learned how to survive by being smart, flexible, and knowing when to stay quiet. But with each year that passed, you faced new struggles, and the cost was always your own sense of self. The boys who did the best in their studies sometimes rose to high positions in the government, becoming trusted officials of the empire. Yet that success came at a terrible price. They had to continue the very same cycle of abuse that had once crushed them. Over time, you began to see something that filled you with dread. Your teachers and supervisors, the men who controlled your life, had once been boys just like you. They too had been stolen from their families, broken down, and reshaped into loyal tools of the empire. Realizing this left you with a painful choice. You could fight against the system and almost certainly be destroyed by it, or you could give in completely, rising higher while becoming one of the same predators who would choose and train the next generation of boys. Many decided it was easier to turn into abusers than to remain victims forever. The end of this training came with a ceremony called Chikma, a graduation that marked your shift from student to imperial servant. By then, you were no longer a child, you were a young man, educated in many languages, trained in politics, science, and art, even skilled in music and calligraphy. On the outside, you seemed polished and ready for a future of power. But inside, you carried scars. Your innocence had been stolen, your trust shattered, and your understanding of power forever tangled with cruelty and exploitation. For many, leaving the school didn't mean freedom. It simply meant stepping into a new stage of the same old trap. Those who entered government learned that politics and sexual favors were still bound together. Those who became soldiers carried the weight of their past abuse, some turning into merciless enforcers of the empire's will, while others broke under the burden and drifted through life, empty and lost. The ruling elite had carefully built a way of thinking that allowed this system to continue while denying the pain it caused. On paper, many forms of abuse were forbidden, but in reality, officials ignored whatever suited their interests. The empire got what it wanted: loyal, skilled administrators and soldiers, and the suffering of the boys was dismissed as unimportant. Any outsiders who dared to criticize the palace were accused of misunderstanding its sophisticated education system. Even some Ottoman writers admitted the harshness of the school while insisting it was worth it. One historian in the 16th century claimed, "Yes, the palace school demands heavy sacrifices, but from it emerge the empire's finest servants, men of loyalty and unmatched skill." Such words painted the system as a noble path, while hiding the truth of what boys endured. Your so-called tests were nothing more than years of abuse. Your discipline was the tearing away of your old self until you no longer remembered the child you had once been. Your lessons were paid for with your innocence, your freedom, and your ability to ever form a truly normal human bond again. What made this palace life especially haunting was the way it mixed real education with suffering so completely that the two were impossible to separate. It was true that you learned skills most of the world could only dream of: reading and writing in multiple languages, mastering sciences and math that were advanced for their time, training in strategy, art, and diplomacy that could shape the destiny of nations. But each of these gains was poisoned by the cost: the slow, deliberate crushing of your childhood and the rewriting of your soul into something that served the empire before anything else. The education you received was tied so closely to pain and exploitation that the two could never be separated. The very men who filled your head with knowledge were the same ones who hurt and used you. The school that promised a future also stole away your innocence, making every achievement feel poisoned by the way it was earned. This system showed how power, desire, and violence were twisted together in older societies. The Ottomans weren't the only ones guilty of such cruelty. Similar things happened in other empires throughout history, but their version stood out because of its size, its order, and how deeply it was woven into the empire itself. It wasn't a secret shame. It was practiced openly, praised for its success, and fiercely defended by those who benefited from it. By the 1600s and 1700s, the palace school started to lose its importance. New styles of warfare made the Janissary Corps less useful, and new methods of ruling lessened the need for palace-trained officials. European influence and changing values also chipped away at the system. But for the countless boys who had already walked through the palace gates during its peak, these changes came far too late. Their lives had already been broken, their childhood stolen, and their voices silenced in the name of imperial power. Some of those boys managed to rise high, becoming viziers, generals, or governors who helped shape the empire's destiny. But even with all that power, they carried deep scars from their time inside those walls, and many of them repeated the same cycles of abuse that had once trapped them. Others vanished into history, their stories never told, their pain reduced to cold records of their arrival, their training, and their assignments. Today, those palace walls are still standing, polished into museums where visitors admire the beauty of domed chambers, marble floors, and glittering art. Tour guides speak proudly about the school's role in glittering art, creating loyal administrators and brilliant leaders. They point out the elegance of the architecture, the innovation of the teaching methods, and the empire's glory. But they do not mention the screams that once echoed through those marble corridors, or the boys who died rather than submit, or the men who walked out alive but never truly whole. The rooms that look so beautiful to tourists still keep their darkest secrets. As I tell this story, it's clear that what happened isn't just some distant curiosity from the past. These were real children torn away from their families, stripped of who they were, and forced to live in a place where their intelligence was valued, but their humanity was ignored. The boy I imagine standing in those silent halls, heart pounding and lips sealed, speaks for thousands of others who will never have their names remembered. Their ghosts linger in those corridors, reminding us that the grandest empires often stood on the suffering of the powerless, and that the true cost of power was paid by those who never had a choice. The real horror wasn't only in the violence itself, but in how carefully it was organized, how completely it became part of daily life, and how easily the world allowed it to be forgotten. You and countless other boys were treated not as children, but as possessions admired for your looks, molded for service, and discarded when your purpose was fulfilled. Your story shouldn't be remembered as some strange detail in a history book, but as living proof of how much cruelty young hearts can endure, and how much strength it takes to survive such cruelty. The footsteps you once dragged across the palace floors at dawn are long gone, but the fear that filled those mornings still echoes through time. It asks us, even now, to look closely and not turn away from the pain you carried. To remember your suffering is to remember the cost that was paid for the Empire's golden age. In telling your story, we don't just honor your lost childhood, we honor every child in history who was crushed beneath the weight of power, used like tools for someone else's glory, their innocence taken in exchange for the ambitions of empires.